Something shifts in you after a certain age, and nobody prepares you for it. The ambitions that used to pull you out of bed start losing their grip. The social obligations that once felt necessary start feeling like performances you can't quite remember the point of. You look around at the life you spent decades building, and a strange question surfaces, one that unsettles you precisely because you don't have an answer for it. Now what? Everyone around you has opinions about what aging should look like. Stay busy, stay relevant, keep up. Don't slow down or you'll rust. And so you watch people in their 60s and 70s and 80s running on fumes of the same engine that powered their 30s, chasing goals that stopped meaning anything real years ago, terrified that if they pause long enough to ask themselves what they actually want from the time they have left, the silence might swallow them. Carl Jung spent the final decades of his life studying something most psychologists ignored entirely: what happens to the human psyche after midlife, and what the aging mind actually needs to thrive rather than merely survive. What he found overturned almost everything Western culture teaches about growing old. He discovered that the strategies that made you successful in the first half of life become the very things that make you miserable in the second half. That the mind doesn't decline with age so much as it changes what it's oriented toward. And that the people who aged with genuine vitality, with depth, with presence, with something you could feel when you sat across from them, had all learned to do something that terrified everyone else. They'd learned to let go of what no longer served them and focus, ruthlessly, on what actually mattered. Today I'm going to walk you through 6 lessons Jung drew from his decades of work with aging patients and from his own experience of growing old. These aren't vague platitudes about enjoying the sunset years. They're specific psychological shifts that determine whether the final chapters of your life become the richest ones you've ever lived, or just a slow, anxious repetition of patterns that expired a long time ago. The first lesson: stop living by the map that got you here. Jung made a distinction that most people never encounter, and it changed everything about how he understood aging. He said the first half of life and the second half of life are governed by entirely different psychological laws. What works in one doesn't just stop working in the other. It actively damages you if you keep applying it. The first half of life is about building. You build an identity, a career, a family, a place in the world. The ego is the engine of this process, and it should be. You need a strong ego to navigate the demands of early adulthood, to compete, to achieve, to establish yourself. The ego's job is to carve out territory, to prove itself, to acquire. And if you did this well, you arrive at midlife with a life that looks, from the outside, like it worked. But Jung observed something troubling in patient after patient who arrived at his office past the age of 40 or 50. The very ego strength that built their life was now strangling it. The drive to acquire had nothing left worth acquiring. The need to prove themselves had no audience that mattered anymore. The identity they'd spent decades constructing felt less like a home and more like a museum, full of artifacts from a life already lived, carefully preserved but no longer alive. Jung would have called this the crisis of the afternoon. He compared human life to the arc of the sun. The morning is about rising, gaining height, gaining power, gaining reach. But at some point, the sun passes its zenith, and the afternoon begins. And the afternoon has its own purpose, its own beauty, its own demands. But you can't live the afternoon by the rules of the morning. Trying to do so is like insisting the sun climb higher when the natural trajectory has already shifted toward descent. This is where most people get stuck. They keep applying morning rules to afternoon life. They chase promotions they don't need. They accumulate things that don't satisfy. They maintain social positions that drain them because stepping back feels like admitting defeat. And all the while, something inside them is whispering that the game they're still playing ended a long time ago. They just never heard the final whistle. The lesson here is uncomfortable but liberating. The map that guided the first half of your life has to be set down. You don't burn it. You don't pretend it was wrong. It served you. It got you here. But here requires a different kind of navigation, one that orients by inner signals rather than external markers of success. If you keep following the old map, you'll stay busy, you'll stay productive, and you'll feel increasingly hollow with every passing year. The second lesson: befriend the parts of yourself you sacrificed to build your life. Every life is built on trade-offs. To become the person you needed to be, the provider, the professional, the responsible one, you had to suppress parts of yourself that didn't fit the role. The artistic impulse you shelved because it wasn't practical. The tenderness you buried because your environment rewarded toughness. The curiosity about things that had nothing to do with your career. The playfulness that didn't survive the pressure of raising a family and paying a mortgage. Jung called these abandoned qualities the unlived life, and he believed they didn't disappear just because you stopped feeding them. They went underground. They settled into the unconscious and waited. And in the second half of life, they start demanding attention with a force that catches people completely off guard. This is why you see retired executives suddenly picking up paintbrushes. Why someone who spent 40 years in finance feels an inexplicable pull toward gardening or philosophy or building things with their hands. Why a woman who performed toughness her entire career finds herself weeping at music she would have dismissed as sentimental 10 years earlier. The unlived life is surfacing. The parts that were sacrificed are asking to be reclaimed. Jung saw this reclamation as one of the most important psychological tasks of aging. He believed that wholeness, what he called individuation, required integrating what had been excluded, and the second half of life is when the psyche finally has enough breathing room to do this work. The children are grown, the career's demands have lessened, the ego's desperate need to maintain its position has started to relax. For the first time, there's space for the question, who am I beyond the roles I've played? The danger is in dismissing these impulses as trivial. The man who feels drawn to writing poetry tells himself it's foolish. The woman who wants to travel alone feels guilty for wanting something that doesn't serve her family. The person who suddenly cares about spiritual questions worries they're becoming soft or losing their edge. They push the unlived life back down because it doesn't match the identity they've maintained for decades. Jung would tell you that every time you push those impulses away, you're refusing a piece of your own wholeness, and the cost of that refusal is the slow, gray, inexplicable flatness that so many people mistake for just getting old. The flatness isn't age, it's the weight of everything you still haven't allowed yourself to become. The third lesson: let your world get smaller on purpose. This one runs against every message you've ever received about aging well. The culture tells you to stay connected, stay social, maintain a wide circle, keep yourself engaged with the world. And there's something to that. Isolation is genuinely harmful, and withdrawal born from depression or fear is a real concern. But Jung drew a crucial distinction between isolation and what he called necessary contraction. He noticed that as people moved deeper into the second half of life, a natural process of narrowing began. Their social world contracted, their interests focused. They became more selective about where they spent their time and energy. And far from being a sign of decline, Jung saw this narrowing as a sign of psychological maturation. The psyche was doing exactly what it needed to do, concentrating its resources rather than scattering them. Think about a river approaching the ocean. As it nears its destination, it often narrows. The channel deepens, the current strengthens. The water that was spread across a wide, shallow plain gathers into something focused and powerful. The narrowing isn't loss, it's concentration. Jung observed the same thing in people who aged well. They didn't try to maintain the sprawling social network of their younger years. They let peripheral relationships fall away and invested deeply in the few connections that genuinely nourished them. They stopped attending events out of obligation and started spending time only in ways that resonated with something real inside them. Their world got smaller, and within that smaller world, everything became more vivid, more meaningful, more alive. The people who resisted this natural contraction, who forced themselves to stay busy, stay social, stay everywhere at once, often burned through their remaining energy maintaining a width of life that came at the cost of depth. They had a full calendar and an empty inner life. They were surrounded by people and profoundly lonely because none of those connections reached below the surface. Jung's lesson here is permission as much as instruction. You're allowed to let your world narrow. You're allowed to say no to the dinner party, the committee, the obligation that drains you. You're allowed to spend a Saturday afternoon doing absolutely nothing that anyone else would consider productive. The narrowing isn't giving up on life. It's finally getting serious about the parts of life that matter to you, specifically you, not the version of you that's been performing for an audience your entire adult life. If this is where you find yourself, in that process of narrowing, of shedding what doesn't fit anymore, of trying to figure out what actually matters when you strip away everything you've been told should matter, there's something that might help you think it through more clearly. We put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, with 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's framework, built for exactly this kind of reckoning. When the old map stops working and you need to orient by something internal instead, these exercises give you a way to listen. Click below if that resonates with where you are right now. The fourth lesson: face your unlived death before it faces you. Jung said something that disturbed many of his contemporaries and still unsettles people today. He said that a person who has not faced their own mortality cannot fully live the second half of their life. That shrinking from death doesn't protect you from it. It just ensures you spend your remaining years running, and running people cannot pay attention to where they actually are. This isn't morbid advice. It's practical. Jung watched patient after patient waste the richest potential years of their life in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety about dying. They didn't talk about it directly. They talked about staying busy, about not wanting to slow down, about needing to keep going. But underneath all of that activity, Jung could see the fear driving it. As long as I'm moving, I'm not dying. As long as I'm producing, I'm still alive. As long as I fill every hour, I don't have to sit with the fact that hours are running out. The irony, and Jung didn't miss it, was brutal. The very strategy they used to avoid confronting death was stealing the life they had left. They were so busy running from the ending that they couldn't be present for the story still unfolding. Jung's own relationship with death evolved significantly as he aged. After a near-death experience in 1944 following a heart attack, he described entering a state of consciousness so vivid, so expansive, that returning to ordinary life felt like a disappointment. He said the experience stripped away his fear entirely, and in the absence of that fear, his remaining years took on a quality of intensity and presence that he'd never known before. He described colors looking different, conversations meaning more, time feeling less like something slipping through his fingers and more like something he was fully inhabiting. Jung believed this wasn't unique to his near-death experience. He believed anyone who genuinely confronted the reality of their own death, who sat with it, who let it become real rather than abstract, would undergo a similar shift. The fear of death doesn't just make you afraid, it makes you unconscious. It puts a filter over experience that dulls everything. And when that filter drops, when you stop running and turn around and look at the thing you've been fleeing, something paradoxical happens. Life becomes more vivid, more precious, more fully yours than it ever was when you were pretending you had unlimited time. This lesson isn't about dwelling on death. It's about the psychological freedom that comes from acknowledging it honestly. The person who has faced their mortality makes different choices than the person running from it. They waste less time on things that don't matter. They say what they mean. They forgive more readily, because grudges feel absurd when you've genuinely reckoned with the fact that everyone involved has limited time. They love more openly, because the risk of vulnerability seems small compared to the certainty of regret. Jung would tell you that the most focused, most present, most alive people he ever encountered in old age were the ones who'd stopped pretending they'd live forever. That pretense is the single biggest obstacle to living fully in the time you have. The fifth lesson: stop trying to be understood and start trying to be honest. There's a shift that happens somewhere in the second half of life, and it has to do with the exhausting project of making yourself legible to other people. You've spent decades translating your inner experience into terms that others could receive. modulating your opinions so they'd land well, editing your emotional responses so they wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable, presenting a version of yourself that the people around you could handle. Jung called this the persona, the social mask, and he recognized that maintaining it consumes enormous psychological energy. In youth, that energy is abundant. You can perform and still have fuel left over. But as you age, the energy available for performance shrinks, and a choice emerges that most people don't realize they're making. You can keep spending your diminishing energy on the mask, or you can redirect it toward actually living. Jung noticed that the people who thrived in old age had, at some point, made a specific decision, usually not consciously, more like a gradual letting go. They stopped curating how others perceived them. They said what they actually thought instead of what would be well received. They expressed preferences directly instead of deferring endlessly to others' comfort. They stopped explaining themselves. This made them unpopular with some people, uncomfortable to be around sometimes. They could come across as blunt or eccentric or difficult. But Jung saw something in them that he didn't see in their more agreeable peers. They were actually present. They were actually in the room. When you talked to them, you were talking to a real person, not a performance of one. And that realness, even when it was prickly or inconvenient, carried a kind of gravity that drew certain people toward them and repelled others. The ones it drew tended to be people who valued substance over pleasantness. The ones it repelled tended to be people who needed everyone around them to remain manageable. Jung himself became increasingly direct as he aged. His letters from his later years are striking in their frankness, sometimes almost brusque. He'd lost patience for diplomatic language and social niceties that obscured rather than communicated. And by every account from people who knew him in his final decades, he was more vital, more engaged, more genuinely present than he'd been when he was younger and more careful about how he came across. The lesson here is about energy. You have a finite amount of it, and it's decreasing. Every unit you spend maintaining a performance is a unit unavailable for actual experience. The math gets starker as you age. At 30, you can afford to waste energy on impression management. At 70, the waste becomes visible. You can see it in the flatness of people who are still performing, still smiling when they don't mean it, still saying "fine" when asked how they are because the real answer would take too long and land too heavy. Honesty in old age isn't rudeness, it's economy. It's the recognition that you don't have enough time left to spend any of it being someone you're not. And the relief that comes with this recognition, the sheer lightness of finally dropping a mask you've been holding up for 50 years, is something Jung considered one of the genuine gifts of aging. A gift most people refuse to unwrap because they're afraid of what will happen when others see their real face. The sixth lesson: your task now is meaning, and meaning cannot be manufactured. Jung saved his most challenging insight for the question that haunts nearly everyone past a certain age. What is the point of all this? When the building is done, when the children are raised, when the career has peaked and descended, when the body has begun its slow, undeniable negotiation with gravity, what are you supposed to orient toward? The culture offers terrible answers to this question. Stay productive, find a hobby, volunteer, travel, keep yourself occupied, all of which treats meaning as something you can generate through activity, as if the emptiness inside can be filled by keeping your hands busy. Jung saw through this completely. He recognized that genuine meaning in old age doesn't come from what you do. It emerges from how you relate to everything you've already done, everything you've already been, and everything you're in the process of becoming. He called this the religious function of the psyche, and he was careful to distinguish this from organized religion. He meant something broader, the human need to feel connected to something that transcends the individual life, to feel that your existence has weight beyond your personal story, to sense that the suffering you've endured and the joy you've experienced are part of something larger than your biography. Jung observed that people who found this connection aged with a quality he described as luminous. They carried their years lightly. They weren't trying to prove anything or achieve anything or become anything they weren't already. They had a kind of settled quality, the feeling of someone who has arrived somewhere internal and is at peace with what they found there, even if what they found was complicated and imperfect. The people who couldn't find this connection, who kept grasping for meaning through achievement or recognition or staying useful, aged with increasing desperation. They grew bitter when the world stopped paying attention to them. They grew anxious when they couldn't stay busy. They grew depressed when the activities they used to fill their time lost their ability to distract from the deeper question they'd been avoiding. Jung believed that the search for meaning in old age requires a specific kind of courage, the courage to look at your life as a whole, including the failures, the betrayals, the wounds, the wrong turns, and find coherence in it. To see the thread that connects the child you were to the person you've become. To recognize that even the most painful chapters served some function in making you who you are. This isn't about positivity or gratitude exercises. It's about integration, Jung's lifelong obsession. Making the disparate, contradictory, messy pieces of a human life cohere into something that, taken as a whole, means something to the person who lived it. And this can't be forced. You can't manufacture meaning the way you manufactured career success. You can't strategize your way into it. Meaning in the Jungian sense emerges when you stop trying to impose a narrative on your life and start listening to the narrative your life has been telling all along. It emerges in quiet moments, when you're sitting with a memory and suddenly see it differently, when a pattern you've repeated for decades suddenly reveals its origin, when you recognize that the thing you've been searching for externally has been growing inside you the entire time. Jung spent his final years at his home in Bollingen, a tower he'd built with his own hands over decades. He carved stone, he wrote, he sat by the lake. His world had narrowed dramatically from the international lecture circuits and crowded consulting rooms of his middle years. And by every account, he was more at peace, more present, more fully himself than he had ever been. The narrowing hadn't diminished him. It had distilled him. He wrote near the end of his life that he was satisfied, a word he chose carefully, because it didn't mean happy in the superficial sense. It meant something closer to complete. He had lived his particular life, with all its chaos and brilliance and mistakes, and he could hold the whole thing without flinching. That holding, that capacity to look at everything you've been and everything you've done and say, this was my life, and it was enough, was, for Jung, the final task of individuation. The last lesson aging has to teach. If you're in this stretch of life right now, if you're trying to figure out what matters, what to let go of, who you are underneath the decades of roles and obligations, the 24 reflection exercises in our True Self-Discovery Guide were built for exactly this kind of work. They're rooted in Jung's approach to self-understanding, designed to help you stop performing your life and start actually inhabiting it. Click below to get True Self-Discovery,